And I think recruiting at every level, if you can't recruit, you can't win. You have to learn how to recruit.
I will not go below 30 unless the player's an absolute stud as far as work ethic.
We'll congratulate each other and chug some beers if somebody wins a national championship.
If they did, don't you think I'd have 2 championships by now? I might have 3.
Now, I know Cash uses those booster gifts. He's always promising cash and women, right?
I've only been caught twice. I've only been caught twice. That's it.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to another episode of This, That, and the Other. I'm your host, Majique, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some areas of Gridiron Dynasty that I think will benefit the first year or second year players. Primarily, we're going to focus on the second year players simply because the information we'll be discussing does speak to part of the evolution of going from D3 to D2. And that regard is for the area of being able to define position roles. And if you're not familiar with that, folks, it's simply a matter of being able to designate certain roles for existing positions. In D3, you have the primary basics. You've got quarterback, running back, wide receiver, etc. Once you leave D3 and you get into D2, D1 AA, and D1, you, of course, are able to assign your position roles to wide receiver. You can have one for deep. You can have one for possession. Running back, for instance, you've got a running back that can be your primary speed back, fullback designee, a variety of ways that you can manage it. Even a possession back to capture the those offenses that like to throw to the back. So they capture that part of the offense as well. And tight ends, you've got possession tight ends, you have the blocking tight ends. It's just a whole new world once you get into D2 when it comes to positions. Now, one of the areas that I have a lot of questions and comments on that tends to confuse people is the position roles along with the stat categories. They refer to the Gridiron Dynasty reports and how Bob calculates the positioning of the players, the recruiting classes, etc. And one of the things you have to understand is every coach can designate his own values for those stat categories. And we've mentioned it in previous shows, but we'll get into it a little bit deeper on this one. And what I mean when I say that is, for instance, I would prefer, for whatever reason, to have more athletic players. So when it comes to creating the values for those position roles, I may want a quarterback that's more athletic than the next guy. So my number value in that field would be a bit higher than he necessarily would use. And the same is true for running backs. I may want one that is a bit more elusive. So the elusive category gets weighted a bit higher, gets a bigger number in there versus the next guy who may want a running back that has more speed. So that's where some of the coaches can differ in regards to the type of players they want, how much weight they put into each of those categories, etc. A good example would be if you have a offense where all you do is block with your tight ends. You don't send any amount for passing. You don't need to worry about them ever catching a pass. Well, then when it comes to establishing the value for that tight end, you wouldn't necessarily put any points or any of the numbers, any of the weights into the receiving part of it, the hands. You know, you would emphasize more of the strength, the technique, the blocking, the game instinct, so that when you're doing your recruit search and when you're setting up your depth chart, you're actually identifying based on the overall core value of that tight end, which one is better suited for your offense because you have preset the weights in those categories that you want them to be to help identify the players that you're exactly looking for. And you can see some of that occur when you're looking in the drop-down menu in your recruiting search. For instance, sticking with tight end, once you've selected your tight end, the position roles, you can look for your blocking tight end, your possession tight end, and your tight end one that you can edit to be whatever you want it to be. The one thing I like to do is use the basic tight end as a combination of the two, because that kind of identifies the tight ends that can be pretty much a jack of all trades if I ever need them. And I use those guys for backups sometimes, rather than have, 3 tight ends on the roster and all of them are good at catching passes, but none of them can block worth a darn. So when you drop down in that recruiting search from tight end, you go from your basic to your blocking tight end, your possession tight end. That's where you can differentiate a little bit more as to what you're looking for. And that's predicated on those position roles that we talked about earlier. You can establish how much weight you want to put in certain categories for your receiving tight ends versus your blocking tight ends. And that's where you would actually see the differences. For instance, let's say that you're searching for a blocking tight end and John Smith shows up as a blocking tight end and he has an overall value of 54.5. You're searching for blocking tight end, and that's where John Smith shows up with a 54.5. If you change that recruit search criteria and drop it down to possession tight end, John Smith may show up again, but now he may be at a 59.5. Well, his value, his core numbers did not change. The only thing that changed is the system of the program is now matching what you have determined for possession tight end for him or for anybody that's doing that recruit search that you're looking for, any of the tight ends. Now they're going to be calculated. Those numbers are going to be calculated based on what you have set in your position roles for receiving tight end. When you're doing the blocking tight end, of course, they'll do the same thing. They'll look at the established or the existing numbers in their core attributes or their overall attributes, depending how you have it set up, and they'll identify the blocking tight ends based on how you've got that set up in your position roles. Now, the reason I mentioned that and got a little bit deep in that is because when we talk about practice time, we're talking about practice. Are we talking about practice, man? We're talking about practice. Allen Iverson, good old Virginia boy. Anyway, when we're talking about practice, the opportunity to set up your practice plan involves a situation where you can determine how much time or how much practice is devoted to a particular area of improving a particular player. And what we'll do there is we will identify certain categories that we want to assign weights to. And let's take a look at this is a fake one, but I'll use it anyway. Let's take a look at this. And as you can see down here, where it says, for instance, on the tight ends, you've got your conditioning 20, your strength 18, your agility 14. And the one issue, if I may just set this aside, the one issue I have is right now at this moment, Gridiron Dynasty does not allow us to practice based on those certain positions that we can set in the depth chart. For instance, right here, this is the only place you're going to set up your practice, and it's for tight ends. Now, ideally, it would allow you to set up a tight end practice for not just tight end, but your tight end possession tight end, your tight end blocking tight end, so that you can actually allocate different values in these categories to those individual position roles. Hopefully, if the Gridiron Dynasty gods show favor to us, that'll be something in a future evolution so that you can even customize it a bit more, so that if you've got a tight end that's going to be your possession tight end, you may want to work him on speed more. You can actually identify that practice time here to where he breaks off and practices his speed and gets that up to snuff, versus you don't want to practice speed necessarily for a blocking tight end. His focus is going to be on the strength and on the blocking aspect, as well as your technique and your game instinct. So this area right here shows the individual practice plan details for the various positions. Now, before you can set these up, it's important to note that above, you want to establish your team practice. You've got 180 minutes total. So what you do is you indicate what time you want dedicated to your offense or multiple offenses, if that's what you choose to do, as well as your defense and your special teams. There's no clear-cut number. You'll hear a variety of folks say anything above 25 is a waste of time. You get diminishing returns. And I buy into that for the most part. Anything less than 5 minutes, you're just wasting your time. So that varies. You, over time, will determine what works best for you, given the results that you've obtained by playing around with this and changing things up based on how you want to try things out. A lot of people will run one offense, one defense, and that's it. And the advantage of that is it actually allows for more position practice. So between your team practice, which focuses on your offensive and defensive sets and special teams, you have the position practice. And that's what we were talking about when we started to look at this graphic. And that's where you identify where you want to put the practice values in these particular columns in order to increase the value of the particular position. So now we're at a point to where we ask, well, what do we do when, how do we figure out what helps a running back with speed? There's nothing on here that says speed. You've got conditioning, strength, agility, passing routes, hands, blocking, tackling, film study, kicking, and punting. For running back, you're going to leave a goose egg in kicking and punting and tackling, I would think, because primarily they don't get involved in that aspect. And we're not talking about kick return or punt return. We're talking about the actual kicker and the actual punter. Same with passing. Gridiron Dynasty does not allow us to run the old halfback pass. So I put a 0 in there. And again, don't use these numbers as some type of, no pun intended, magic formula, because they're not. They're just random numbers thrown in there. Some of them are pretty close to what I run, but excuse me, for the most part, they're just numbers set in order to provide an example. One of the things that I do need to stress is the reason you want to set your position practice after you establish your team practice is because if you set your position practice, and like in this case, 115 minutes, and then you look up and you decide, you know what, I want to practice about 5 more minutes in my team practice. Well, remember I said it's a team practice, position practice total of 180 minutes. Team practice, you move that number up 5 minutes. That time has got to come from somewhere, and the program would automatically pull it from your position practice details. So what happens in this case, if we were to bump team practice up 5 minutes, it would say 70 instead of 65, and down below in position practice, it would say 110 versus the 115. And it will, when I say it, the program will not necessarily pull 1 minute from some of those in order to balance it out. I've seen it go 2 minutes in one, none in the other, and 3 minutes in another. It's helter-skelter for the most part. So set up your team practice first. When you're sure that you're not going to have to adjust it, then you can go down and set your position practice up. And in order to set your position practice up, on the right-hand side up the top where it says position practice 115 minutes, you notice those are all custom in the far right-hand drop-down menu. Those have a variety of different setups. You've got the default, you've got custom, balanced, etc. And those are the ones that the program will automatically assign. They're kind of like default presets, for lack of a better term. I prefer to use custom. That way I have more control of where I'm allocating my minutes to position practice. Got a little more control over where my guys are practicing for what purpose. Now, we talked about there not being anything in there to indicate speed. If you want to increase your wide receiver, your running back speed, how do you do that? Well, that's where we go to this little sheet here, right here. This will help you quite a bit. This is your practicing and what it improves. Now, if you notice on the left, you've got conditioning, blocking, tackling, pass routes, etc. Back on the first screen, that's what you have. your conditioning, strength, agility, your pass routes, your hands, your blocking. Those are all the things that are listed here. Not necessarily in that exact same order. But the beauty of this little cheat sheet is that you can see what you need to put value in order to improve the items under the improved list. Now, we talked about speed for running backs and wide receivers. If we want to increase speed, you'll notice that speed is an improvement when you're practicing conditioning. It's also an improvement when you're practicing agility. So if you're strictly looking to improve your speed, you would put more emphasis on practicing your agility and your conditioning. Now, one thing that stands out, if you look closely, you'll notice that there are only, I believe, 2 of these practicing subjects that do not directly impact technique. All the others impact technique. And that stands to reason because theoretically, if you're practicing a particular skill, the more you do it, theoretically, the more refined you become at doing that. So that improves your technique. So if you're a quarterback and you're constantly passing, it stands to reason your technique's going to improve. The same with a punter and kicker. The more you do it, the better your technique is going to be. Same with hands. The more footballs you catch, the better your technique becomes. So a lot of this is almost like a double dip. For instance, if you're putting a lot of value in your blocking column to improve the blocking of your offensive lineman, let's say, not only does it improve the blocking aspect, but it also improves the technique. And technique is one of the core values in, I would say, every position. You know, you can get a linebacker that's big, strong, fast, but if he doesn't have the technique to make use of his great tackling skill, then what good is he? You know, it'd be like Steve Urkel running into a wall. Nothing's going to happen except Steve's going to fall on his butt. So the technique aspect is really covered in all of these but 2. So no matter what you're doing, you're going to improve the technique, which is something I truly like. Let's look at pass routes, for instance. Elusiveness. When you're practicing your pass routes, that improves your elusiveness. Now, what does elusiveness mean to someone going out for a pass route? Well, I akin that to being able to juke the defender on the first move. You know, you've as a wide receiver, you've broken away from that defender. So you've essentially eluded him, and it increases your opportunity to be open. It increases your opportunity to be in better position to catch the ball. So that's what elusiveness talks about. Strength, athleticism, and durability. When you're doing strength practicing, those 3 are going to go up. And remember earlier I mentioned I like really athletic players because they tend to perform a little bit better. So whenever I'm practicing strength or I'm doing conditioning and agility, I know that their athleticism is improving as well. So hopefully that clears up some of the questions that especially new people have regarding what do you practice in order to improve certain attributes for those cores for your players. And we had a comment. Let's see, Bob, I don't see Bob on the show, but there was a message saying he was here. He must be watching. Okay. Well, Bob, if you want to join, by all means, pop on in here. Love to talk with you more and let you explain some more insights regarding the GD reports that you've produced for many, many, many years that so many people rely on and so many people value. I being one of those people. Definitely a super great tool. Let's go ahead and look at something now that a lot of people are really confused about. And it took me a long time to understand this, and that is potential and work ethic. How do they work with one another? How do they play off one another? What's the secret to getting the most out of your players? Do you want to go for the high work ethic guy, or do you want to go for the high potential guy? Again, you'll hear as many differing opinions on this subject as there are GD players. You know, I've changed my opinion and my views on that several times since I've been playing. But several years ago, I created what I call my water and cylinder. And analogy. Bear with me. Essentially, what it amounts to is you've got a source of water, and you've got a destination for that water, and that's your cylinder. Your cylinder represents the potential of a player. You know, how full is that player going to get? How big is that cylinder? How full is that cylinder going to be? And the thing I really like is this graphic really shows in basic format how the two work and how the two interact with one another. And bear with me, Bob's saying when he clicks on the StreamYard link that shows the show has ended, man, that sucks. I don't know why it's doing that. Bob, I'm sorry, brother, but I don't know why that's doing that. And if I stop it now, then everything will be discombobulated. So forgive me, but we'll go ahead on with the show and just make it a short one tonight then, since we're apparently having some issues. Back to the potential and work ethic thing. The reason the cylinder and the water graphic really solidified my understanding is that, as I said, it's visual. I'm a visual learner. If I see something that makes it easier for me to comprehend, and hopefully when I put this slide up, it'll help you out as well. So let's see if I can find that and pop it up here. Oh, looky there. There it is. The work ethic faucet and the potential cylinders. As you can see, very low, low, average, high, and very high. Of course, they're all different sizes. And that stands to reason, because a player who is very high potential is going to grow quite a large amount compared to a guy who has very low potential. Now, that is the nuts and bolts of it. Your potential is how good these guys can be based on where they're starting from. So let me just throw in one little caveat here. If you have a running back, for instance, with a core value of 50, and he comes back with a scouting report that says he has very low potential, and you have another running back and his scouting report comes back and says he has very high potential, but when you look at it, his core is 35. Now, I doubt if there's anybody out there that would actually think that a very high potential core value 30 running back will ever surpass a very low potential 50 core value running back. That's 15 core points to overcome. And I don't know that it would happen. And if it did, it would have to happen after his senior year, being redshirted a year. And that's when you question, is it really worth it? What we're talking about here in this graphic or this depiction is we're predicating all of this on a player comparison where the player's core values are centrally equal. We're talking, a particular player has a 50 core value, the next one may have a 49 or a 51. So they're in the relative same neighborhood. So let's get to what this actually is showing you. The work ethic faucet is the water coming out, and the water fills up these cylinders. So your work ethic meter or your dial indicates how much water you're putting out of that faucet. So as this purple dial is indicating, we're looking at probably, I would say, a work ethic of 7. So, if you're letting the water drip out at a work ethic of 7, it's going to take forever to fill up those cylinders. So if you've got a player with a low potential and a player with a high potential, and they both have a 7 work ethic, it's going to take forever. But that low player's potential, he will reach his max potential, which is considered low, much sooner than the player who is a high potential valued player, because there's still a lot more to fill up. So imagine if you had these 2 cylinders or these 2 buckets sitting out on your deck, and you've got a water hose coming into one and a water hose going into the other, and they both have the same volume output. It stands to reason the smaller bucket's going to fill up first, but it's not necessarily going to do you any good, because the very next drop, the high potential player is going to be better than the low bucket that's already filled. He can't get any better. So you take that dial and you move it, let's say you move it to 50. Well, what that means is that same example of a low player and a high player at a 50 work ethic, that water is going to be coming out of that faucet a whole lot faster. So those two players are going to grow so much faster than the 7 work ethic player. But again, that low potential player's cylinder is going to fill up and not improve any, whereas the high potential player is going to fill up at the same rate because they have the same work ethic, but he's going to continue to fill up. So at the end of his 4 years, he is going to present you with a better overall core value than that low potential player, given that they all started off about the same core value set. So the big thing to remember here is there is no magic formula. There is no cure-all. There is no catch-all. There is no one-stop shop for the best answer. It all depends on the player, where he starts at, what his potential is, and how quickly he is going to maximize that potential. Now, when we talk about being able to maximize that potential, there's a lot more that goes into that factor other than just the work ethic. You can have the best work ethic in the world for a player, but if he's not getting that playing time that he expects, he's probably not going to improve very much. Excuse me. So that's to be considered as well. The other thing you need to look at is his core values that we talked about. They are going to increase at a relatively equal level unless you set up the various values that we talked about earlier on to improve certain parts. Now, that's not going to change his potential, but it may change his work ethic. And why it may change his work ethic is if you're putting, particularly, let's say a running back, if you're putting more practice time in a running back speed and his speed improves and he's not a starter, but after 3 or 4 games, his speed and his elusiveness has improved to where he's now bumped the guy that he was behind. Well, that equates to more playing time. So now more playing time increases his work ethic. Theoretically, that's what happens. The more playing time they get, the happier they are, the more work ethic you generally see. So, yeah, I was asked, does practicing certain things help increase work ethic? And that's how it can go about doing it. There's not a clear-cut issue where you can increase work ethic. Let's see on this previous slide, if I can pop that back up. You see on the left, there's nothing there that says anything about increasing work ethic. But again, if you practice a particular player to where his attributes increase, then he will possibly bump the guy that's ahead of him, thus getting more playing time. Thus, a byproduct is increased work ethic. So hopefully that explains some things for you. Hopefully I haven't confused you too much. I know that it can be quite easily confusing, especially when you're a new player and you've got so many of these boxes to check, so many of these boxes to put values in, and so many different aspects of the game that you didn't see at D3 that you're now being exposed to at D2. Be patient, trust the system. Don't be afraid to massage your plans. Don't be afraid to change things up. You may find that something really ticks and works for you. Another coach may find that it doesn't particularly work for him. So again, there's no clear-cut answer. That's what makes this game so wonderful, is that everybody can get out of it a little bit something different from time to time. And the overall result is a different experience, different success rates. But the fun thing is practicing, not what I'm talking about with the setup earlier. I'm talking about yourself practicing on what you do, working the system, so to speak, changing up your game plan, changing up your playbooks. And hopefully, like I said, you'll find something that works for you. Again, I apologize for the apparent technical difficulty. I was really looking forward to having Bob on. I don't know if there was a link issue screw up on my part or the systems, but nonetheless, we made a 30-minute show out of it, and hopefully there's some information that somebody can use to their benefit, and hopefully it'll help you improve. So we'll get this issue fixed, and we'll see you again here probably in 2 weeks, and maybe, just maybe, we'll have Adam on to give us an update on the behind-the-scenes progress that's going on at What If Sports, especially for us Gridiron Dynasty folks. So thank you for tuning in and watching the show on YouTube. Don't be afraid to leave me any comments or questions or messages. Always willing to help. Always looking forward to interacting with the GD community. Thanks a lot, fellas and ladies, and we'll see you next time. I'm your host, Majique. Thanks for tuning in.